This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are going to speak with Iftach Cohen, co-founder of Front-LEX, a non-profit legal organisation challenging EU border violence in court. Iftach is going to tell us all about the Alaa Hamoudi case. So Alaa Hamoudi is a Syrian man who was pushed back from Greece to Turkey by the Greek Coastguards in 2020. All of this happened right under the eyes of the European Border and Coastguard Agency, which is known as Frontex. Try not to confuse, like I do, Frontex, the European Border and Coastguard Agency, and Front-LEX, which is Iftach Cohen's awesome organisation. Anyway, Iftach is going to tell us how Front-LEX won this case for Hamoudi at the EU's top court in January. And he's going to explain why this landmark legal victory should, and I quote, benefit all future victims of Frontex's activities and bring an end to its de facto immunity in court. Iftach and I will also discuss a report from Frontex's human rights official on the Greek government using Afghan paramilitaries to push people back to Turkey. It's absolutely insane. Okay, so before we get on with today's episode, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a news blog with news reports, interviews, and investigative stories. So if you'd like to find out more about that, go to civilfleet.com. Also, if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing and you would like to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we have on this podcast, then you can do a couple of things. You can share us on social media, you can give us ratings on podcast apps and things like that, and you can put your money where your mouth is and you can make a small donation to us. If you go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet, you can make a small donation there. You can make a monthly one if you like, a recurring one, or just one-off. And you'll also get a bonus episode, which is on there too. And I should really get some more of those on there. Yeah, so that's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Our costs are super low, but any help you can give us will be greatly appreciated. All right, on with the show. Iftach, thank you very, very much for coming on the Civil Fleet.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So you work with an organisation called Front-LEX. We're going to talk about Front-LEX today. We're going to talk about Frontex. We're going to talk about some cases of pushback and abuse and a legal victory in Greece and based around Greece in today's episode. But before we talk about all of that, I like the people in my podcast to tell us a bit about themselves. So Iftach, you can tell us as much or as little about yourself as you like. I'd like the listeners to know a little bit about you, and I would too.
Absolutely. So I was born in Israel, Palestine, where I co-founded a legal firm specializing in Supreme Court litigation on human rights cases, including targeted killings in the West Bank and Gaza, the siege on Gaza, the 2010 flotilla raid, the Marmara flotilla raid, resulting in the killing of 8 activists on board. And I was also the co-founder of We Are Refugees, Anu Plitim in Hebrew, an NGO that provided pro bono legal representation to detained asylum seekers, co-litigated the constitutional petition against the anti-infiltration law, which allows the detention of asylum seekers for up to 3 years without judicial review. The Israeli Supreme Court struck down the law, and as a result, some 1,500 asylum seekers were released from detention. Then I moved to Italy in 2014, where I directed an innovative legal project aimed at providing tailor-made legal information to asylum seekers in the immediate surrounding of the hotspots in Sicily. And later on in 2021, I co-founded Front-LEX, registered in the Netherlands, the legal hub challenging EU migration policies through strategic litigation before European courts and international courts, with the aim of ending the de facto legal impunity enjoyed by EU institutions for their complicity in crimes against people on the move.
Wow, that's amazing background. I don't know if we've had anyone with your background on before. That's amazing. And do you have like a back? Did you? Are you a lawyer now? Would that be correct thing to describe your job now?
Yeah, I am actually the co-director of Front-LEX and the litigation manager. And yes, I am the litigation manager of all of the cases that we have filed against Frontex and soon enough against Europol as well.
Ah, well, and yeah, and you guys have done some amazing work, and I think we can talk about that. But I think before we talk about what Front-LEX is, why don't we talk a little bit about Frontex? I think most people listening to this podcast will have heard of Frontex, which is the European Border and Coastguard agency. But maybe can you give us kind of an overview, just in case this is someone's first episode or someone who's not quite sure what Frontex is? And I'm sure in this episode I'm going to confuse Frontex and Front-LEX. So apologies if I do that.
It really happens all the time. We had to choose a name, but we are stuck with that. So yes, our rivals, Frontex, is the European Union Agency for Border and Coastguard. It coordinates, finance, and support border control operations at the EU's external border, including surveillance and returns. So basically, it designs, finances, and coordinates those joint operations. They are named Frontex Joint Operation, with any possible host member state, be it Greece, Italy, Spain, Malta, and also the participating member state, all of the other member states willing to basically operate, let's say in Greece, only because Frontex is coordinating those activities. And along the years, in each and every jurisdiction where Frontex operates, it actually facilitates and cover up violations against people on the move. So this is Frontex in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's operating it's in the Mediterranean. I think it's at the border with Poland and Belarus maybe, and it's definitely in Greece, which is what we're going to talk about, right? And so tell us about Front-LEX. What is it? What can you tell us about the name? I've always been intrigued by why did you call it Front-LEX, and what does it mean?
A little, we actually tried to echo the name of our rivals, and Lex has a very distinct legal meaning. So this is why we are called Front-LEX. This is why many other journalists like you get between the names, but I'm very used to it as well. And when we filed the very first legal action against Frontex, it was 2021, and that was the very first legal action ever to be filed against Frontex. And the thing is that we didn't discover America, it was not under research in the academia, it was not under research or let's say that no one was oblivious to the fact that Frontex, a EU coercive border control agency, can basically systematically avoid legal review while its victims cannot enjoy their fundamental rights to legal remedy and access to the court. And the thing is that no one else ever filed any legal action against Frontex, knowing just how restrictive are the competent courts, the Court of Justice, admissibility requirement. And we were also not oblivious to the fact that the very first legal action that we would eventually file against Frontex is most certainly a dead-on-arrival case. But our political understanding was that it should be the judge telling us no rather than academic piece, and that changes in the jurisprudence of the courts come mostly when the judges grow uncomfortable with each and every unjust ruling of them. So indeed, the judges told us no time and again. In just a bit less than 4 years, we filed 4 major cases seeking the suspension of the joint operations in Greece, a legal action for damages, a legal action for annulment. So basically, we knocked on each and every available door available to the victims of Frontex, the theoretically open avenues for them, to basically expose that in the European Union, a union based on the rule of law, again, what I said before, a coercive border control agency can systematically avoid judicial review, while its victims are left with no legal remedy. And that was, in a way, losing those cases preceding to the big victory in the Hamoudi versus Frontex appeal, serve the bigger purpose in that way in our strategic litigation. And I can connect the dots between the cases, what I call defined as dead-on-arrival cases, to the big victory that we had last year with the Hamoudi versus Frontex appeal.
And yeah, and as you said on your website, which I thought was quite interesting. Where is it? That the complicity of that Frontex kind of gives cover, like can be like a legitimizer, or it can enable member states, to do pushbacks or to get away with things. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, look, I think that in terms of aiding and abetting, which is maybe easier for the listener to comprehend, even if he or she does not have a PhD in law, it's quite like, think of 2 people planning a bank robbery, and one enters with a gun and the other is creating mirror and smoke outside to distract people. Can we say that the person aiding and abetting outside is less complicit? So Frontex, in that way, its contribution is intertwined in each and every violation within the geographical area where it operates. It designs the case, the joint operation. It is the executive director who drafts the operational plan, and from that we can say that Frontex has, in many occasions, also normative control on the operation. It finances it. It coordinates it. It provides assets of its own, of other member states that, again, are willing to participate in those highly contentious operations only because Frontex is there. So you cannot really separate Frontex contribution from each and any violation taking place in the operational area where it operates. But more than that, and this is maybe more subtle, Frontex attributes the presumption of legitimacy on the actions and omissions of Greece, for example, or of its partner in any possible joint operation. Only an EU agency can provide confer that presumption of legitimacy on a defiant member state who might very well, let's think of Greece. Greece might actually execute, like financially and in terms of equipment, it might anyway advance that unlawful policy of widespread and systematic attack against asylum seekers, civilians in the Aegean. It might as well do the same without the financial and operational and coordinative support of Frontex. but it would not be in the same position of advancing such a manifest unlawful state policy in the Aegean for so many years unless Frontex is there. So that's why we've heard in so many different occasions before the European Parliament Greek ministers saying mostly the one thing that absolved them from any wrongdoing. Frontex is there, so you cannot pass so easily. And this is word by word of at least one of the ministers appearing before the Libe committee. So let's think of Legeri, the poster boy of pushbacks.
He was the former head of Frontex, wasn't he? What was his first name? Is it Fabrice Legari?
Fabrice Legeri or Legeri, because I think his ancestries are Italian. So Legeri should be the right pronunciation. Okay. So also he was so engaged in covering up. We'll speak later about him actually covering up evidence of pushbacks taking place in the Aegean since March 2020. But in also each and every appearance of him before the Libe committee or before the press, that guy says there are no indications of any violation. So again, it was harder probably for the Commission, or easier if you wish for the Commission, not to initiate infringement procedures against Greece. I'm naive, I'm sure they wouldn't have done it anyway, but this is an important piece in the puzzle that's shielding those defiant member states. Or think about the current executive director of Frontex, who is actually more engaged than Legeri in the commission of a larger scale of violation in both in the Aegean and both in the Central Mediterranean. But if you remember, the day after the Pylos shipwreck in June 2023, when it was very clear to anyone knowing anything about the situation, the SAR activities or pushback, the systematic practice of pushbacks in the Aegean, it was very clear that was a pushback attempt being conducted by the Greek authorities, resulting in the death of more than 700 people. So he took time to, and on camera, praised the Hellenic Coastguard colleagues of him, saying that they did their utmost to save lives. So again, each and every, there are a million different examples of how Frontex is more than anything else engaged in covering up, facilitating pushbacks, covering them up, and providing this precious political support. More important, I'd say, than the financial, the operational, or the coordinative support. The political support that only an agency of the EU can confer on a defiant member state.
Yeah, well said. And I just want to mention two things. We talked about Fabrice. I'm going to say his surname wrong, Legari or Legeri. I'm sure that he's ended up he left Frontex, and I think he's joined the far right party in France. I think it's the Front National or La Marche or something. I can't remember what they're called, but I think he's joined them, right? And then the Pylos shipwreck that you spoke about, we've got an episode. People listening should check out our episodes on the Pylos shipwreck, is it the Spiros or the Pylos? The Spiros. Pylos, yeah. We have some episodes about that, so I'll have links for people listening to check those episodes out, because that is a crazy, unbelievable case.
That may be incident, okay? So 700 people perished, died, were killed, you name it. That is a violation, so serious violation that Frontex was compelled the day after to immediately suspend or terminate its operations in Greece. Because Frontex is bound both by positive obligations, that is, to take any reasonable measure to protect the lives and rights of concerned people affected by its activities, and also by negative obligation that is not to arm directly, actively to those people. And Frontex is in breach of both obligation for years in Greece, previously in Hungary, but the legislator understood very well that you cannot separate Frontex contribution from each and every violation that will ever take place in the framework of its joint operation. Again, I think that the legislator was also very aware of the political, what we were just talking about, the political support, not only the financial support. So it was the legislators striking the line, the balance, saying where there are only related violations of serious nature or persisting ones, merely related to any possible activity of Frontex, Frontex shall, the executive director shall terminate or suspend those operations immediately. So the only whether Frontex is in a position to genuinely evaluate and consider whether there are or there are not related violations, okay? So in that case, in Pylos, but in tens of other cases preceding the Pylos tragedy, not a tragedy actually, it was not a tragedy, it was an intentional case of attempted pushback carried out by Frontex and the Greek authorities jointly. So that, as any other preceding case, compelled Frontex to immediately suspend its operation in the eyes of the legislator to avoid any contribution that will advance those violations. But Frontex refrains from doing it for years and years now. In Hungary, it did so only 4 months after the Court of Justice basically accepted the infringement proceeding initiated against Hungary by the Commission, but it took it 4 months to do so, and in Greece it refrains from doing it since March 2020. In the Central Mediterranean, it continues to provide the coordinates of refugee boats it detects in the Central Mediterranean, in the pre-frontier area, to Libyan entities and militia. So Leggeri, for example, did his best to say that there aren't any violations for him to avoid basically complying with the law. But nowadays the situation is is worse, if you wish, because the executive director, the fundamental rights officer, they all admit that there are violations, but instead of basically complying with the strict obligation imposed on it by the legislator, they read in that provision, which is Article 46.4 of Frontex founding regulation, and saying we prefer basically to apply a reversed Article 46.4. So if Article 46.4, the legislator told us you need to immediately suspend or terminate operations in the event of related human rights violation, they say we believe that our presence there has a chilling effect on the defiant member state. So instead of terminating and suspending, we shall increase the operation. And this is the bigger rule of law crisis, if you wish, where an EU agency permits itself to basically ignore the law and to read in or to come up with its own law. So this is something Leggeri didn't allow himself to do, and he actually ran to office and is now in the better position to change the law. But this should be the rule also for the current executive director and the fundamental rights officer. You don't like the law, resign and run to office.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, I think we could talk about Frontex for a long time, and you've obviously very it's really good to have you on because you're very knowledgeable and very passionate about the bad things that they've done. Thanks for that, Iftach. Let's move on to Alaa Hamoudi's case. But before that, actually, why don't we talk a bit about the situation in general, like in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey? Like, there's lots of pushbacks there. We've just been talking about the Pilos shipwreck. So I think since at least I became aware of pushbacks there, very obvious ones in 2020. There was like people filming themselves being pushed back. People on the move were filming themselves being pushed back, and it's been a pretty bad situation there, right, for a long time, for at least 5 years, 6 years even, but probably longer, right?
Look, violations in that area, like violations have been reported for the last 15 years. It's not a new phenomenon. However, in March 2020, following the opening of the borders by Erdogan, the National Greek Security Council, I think it was the 1st of March 2020, came up with, let's say, a roadmap, a decision with four components. And the first three are very telling. First, to suspend immediately the national asylum system, which is a violation of EU law. Second, to return, and they didn't shy away from saying it in writing, the return without any individualized assessment or registration of people intercepted in the Aegean, in the immediate return. So this is basically them admitting that they had in mind collective expulsions with different code names. And the third point was to immediately request Frontex to launch a rapid border intervention in the Aegean. And Frontex, it took the executive director Leggeri less than 24 hours to approve that unlawful rapid border intervention. But then you see that the rapid border intervention was meant to implement those first two unlawful points in the Greek authorities' decision. And ever since March 2020, there is an unlawful state and organization policy of widespread and systematic attack against civilians, asylum seekers in the Aegean, which amount to crime against humanity. And Frontex agreed to that unlawful division of labor, where it only detects the refugee boats in the Aegean, hand them over to the Greek authorities, to the Hellenic Coastguard, and then watch from its surveillance aircraft and sometimes sends uncanny pictures to its headquarters of the agency, of 20, 30, 40 people being towed for hours, because pushback, it's not like really pushing back in a second. It's a very violent and lengthy unfolding operation. It's a torturous one. So for hours and hours, those airplanes transmit to the headquarters pictures of people being towed on rubber boats to be eventually abandoned for hours again, sometimes drifting for the entire night, close enough to the Turkish territorial water before they are being rescued by the Turkish Coast Guard. So, the amount of evidence is overwhelming, and there I think that this is a good maybe moment to shed a light also on the failure of the competent court to adjudicate cases against Frontex, because civil society tends to point the finger to the Commission, to the Management Board of Frontex, for the European Parliament's failure to basically hold that agency to account. And of course, the criticism is valid, but in a democratic society where all those institutions fail to do their job, the last resort is the court. And up until the latest judgment of the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice in the Hamoudi versus Frontex appeal, we've seen how the judges were very reluctant to basically provide effective legal protection to those, the most vulnerable legal subject in the European Union, the victims of Frontex. So they applied a highly restrictive, and they still do, highly restrictive admissibility requirement that were meant to regulate commercial activities. So think of a pharma company that is unhappy with a new taxation that the commission decided to apply to a certain medication, okay? So company will very easily provide the court, the judges, with a proof that it already produces 1 million pills of that certain medication, and if indeed the judges will not interfere in the new taxation, the pharma company's commercial interest will be jeopardized. Okay? So this is the, let's say, the basic admissibility requirement. You need to show the judges that upon the filing of your legal action, your situation is already being jeopardized for certain. They use that term, certainty. Okay? Now, when they ask the asylum seeker stranded in Libya or stranded in Turkey, following mostly previous pushbacks, to provide them with evidence that he or she will certainly be detected by Frontex and then handed over to the Greek authorities, or then being handed over to Libya militia. So it is a certain thing that the rights to life will be jeopardized. Those asylum seekers cannot do what the pharma company can do. They cannot provide such a conclusive evidence, boat ticket, or also what if only 90% of people crossing the Mediterranean being then detected by Frontex, handed over to Libya militia, and then subjected to crimes against humanity upon forced disembarkation in Libya. What if only 90% rather than the certainty of 100%? So those judges, in order to protect or to reserve their precious judicial time, they are willing to review the evidence, to review the law, basically to admit the case, only if you, when you knock on their door, can prove them that right now, upon the filing of your legal action, it is 100% sure that you will be harmed by the measure that you challenge. This is impossible for an asylum seeker to prove, and that's first few cases were rejected as inadmissible, notwithstanding the amount of clear and cut evidence. For again, we need to only substantiate that there are persisting or serious violations only related to the contested activity. And the judges were not willing to even review those evidence or the law.
And I think the Alaa Hamoudi case, did that change that? Or maybe actually before that, why don't we talk about Alaa Hamoudi's case? So I think I can't remember where he's from actually, but he arrived in Greece in April 2020. He was sent back to sea by the Greek Coastguards or the Hellenic Coastguards. And I think they were left to float in the Aegean for many, many hours until they were picked up by the Turkish Coastguards, who then took them back to Turkey. And then I think he was in touch with a journalist called Bashar Deeb, who has been on the Civil Fleet podcast. And I think he works for Lighthouse Reports. And I think Bellingcat was also involved, and they got in touch with you guys, right? Could you tell us about that case and how you won it for him?
Yeah, thanks Bashar Dib, and first he did an amazing job in reconstructing the pushback operation taking place on 28, 29 of April 2020 in the fullest way, gathered extremely strong evidence and got in touch with the victims. And those things are almost impossible for a small-scale European NGO to do autonomously. Mainly the tracking down, the getting in touch with the applicant. So when I read the reconstruction of that pushback, which was published in May 2020, I mean, afterwards we saw countless articles by Der Spiegel, Il País, everyone, on the systematic practice of pushbacks in the Aegean, but Bashar Dib was the first person to, and Lighthouse report, and it was, as you said, published by Bellingcat, they were the first to ever reconstruct such a pushback operation. And when I read it, I got in touch with Bashar, and he was extremely helpful, and only thanks to him, again, not only because he gathered those strong evidence, but because otherwise it would have been impossible for me to get in touch with Alaa Hamoudi, and I flew to meet him in Turkey. And there is another aspect to it that Bashar got in touch and interviewed two asylum seekers, two victims of the group that was, 21 other people were pushed back next to Alaa Hamoudi. And the other asylum seeker didn't want to even have a call with me. So this is also a prevalent thing that the victims, when they reach Europe, if they ever reach Europe or otherwise still stranded in Turkey, they are very reluctant to even engage in a conversation, to open the wounds. So Alaa was very, very courageous, and I flew to Turkey. It was COVID time, and I interviewed him to see whether his testimony is specific enough, detailed, coherent, and also to compare him with a person that was photographed in Samos the morning that the group made landfall in Samos, and that person was Alaa Hamoudi. And I got the photograph from Bashar Dib. At the beginning, it was also attached to the article published by Bellingcat. So I flew there and convinced Alaa to take part in this journey. And when we filed the case, we were quite sure that the photograph, which is very rare evidence, photographic evidence, stemming from a pushback operation is extremely rare. I was sure that that was the jackpot because, again, you couldn't quite see, it is true, for a murder case where the evidentiary standard should be beyond of any reasonable doubt. As a judge or as a lawyer, I would probably be very careful to say that that photograph reaches that evidentiary standard. But we are not dealing with criminal proceedings, but only with civil proceedings relating to the violation of human rights. And when I compared Alaa, after having spent 2 days with him, with the young, bearded asylum seeker photograph there in Samos, I was very sure it was him. And for the judges, I'm jumping ahead, when they rejected, the first instance judges, when they rejected the case, although Frontex admitted during the proceedings that rare photographic evidence allows for a reasonable comparison with Alaa Hamoudi or with any other person. And I was requesting the judges to only allow Alaa to appear before them, for them to do the same thing that I did in Turkey, to compare him to that person showed in the photograph from Samos. The judges rejected our trivial request to hold a hearing, And I remind you that Alaa was the very first applicant against Frontex in any legal action for damages. It's not like they saw millions such cases and that was just one among many. They request to hold an hearing and concluded that the person showed in that photograph from Samos, and I remind you it was clearly a young bearded asylum seeker, they concluded that he or she lowered their faces. So even implying that a person with the beard can be a she shows you how antagonistic they were to that case. But the Court of Justice made Alaa justice and took in account all of our factual and legal arguments that in that scenario, operational scenario of a pushback operation where the absence of registration and the absence of identification and the fact that phones are being confiscated immediately upon the beginning of that pushback operation means that those victims would never be in a position to provide direct evidence, such as a photographic evidence or any registration form saying I was here in Samos and applied for asylum, and 5 minutes later I was rounded up and taken to the shore. So they accepted that factually we cannot provide direct evidence, that there are other conventions in order to basically verify the truth, like how credible is the testimony or the allegation made by the victim. And by that I mean the very careful assessment of the testimony, of the statements of the victim. And they also accepted that Frontex has exclusive evidence and basically has exclusive access to the most compelling evidence that might help the victim to substantiate his or her allegations. So that judgment of the Court of Justice from last year, the December 2025, basically changed EU law and brought up an adjustment of the method, standard, and burden of proof in all expulsion cases, not only in Alaa Hamoudi's specific case, and also ordered the first instance judges, imposed on them new duties to basically investigate the case, which seems very trivial, but we didn't see it before. We didn't see a willing judge willing to basically do his or her job and to evaluate the truthfulness of the allegations. So now Frontex is obliged to provide evidence to which it has exclusive access, something that Frontex never did before. Now the victims are exempted from the obligation to provide conclusive evidence, impossible in such a scenario, factual scenario, and the judges themselves must take further steps in the.
Sorry, you cut out there a little bit, Iftach. I think you said it cut out like maybe 10 seconds. If that, I'm not sure if you can remember what you were saying about 10 seconds ago. I think you said it forced the judge to change something, or that you were talking about how the case changed the law, how the judges had to consider new evidence.
They imposed the judges of the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice imposed new obligations on two parties to the proceedings, on the judges to take any possible further step in order to reveal the truth behind the allegation, so to obtain from Frontex any relevant information at its disposition, and on Frontex itself to voluntarily cooperate, to diligently cooperate with the proceedings. So instead of being a party to the proceedings, wishing to probably win the case or not to lose it, Frontex needs to be an officer of the court, to help the judges to reveal the truth behind the allegations. And this new obligation, far-reaching obligation on a party to the proceedings, has a lot to do in the eyes of the 15 judges of the Grand Chamber with what we were talking about before. The main obligation of Frontex in terms of safeguards and protection tools, the main obligation of Frontex to terminate or to suspend operations where there are related violations. So the judges, the 15 judges said, this is the utmost obligation of yours, Frontex and the executive director. And because you, dear executive director, first and foremost need to know whether there are such violations related to the activities in Greece, related to the activities in the Central Mediterranean or in Hungary, your first interest is to basically cooperate with the applicant, with the judges, to reveal the truth, not to win the case. So in case indeed Alaa Hamoudi got it right, and he actually alleged about a violation that did take place, you need to know it. You don't need to obscure the truth. So that's why Frontex now, very differently than any normal party to the proceedings, needs to provide every possible information that might help the judges to reveal the truth.
That is really good, isn't it? That's a major change, right? Rather than, like you said, being defensive and trying to win the case, now they have to help the judge discover what's actually happened. Does that mean that they will have to release, I think you said this, they'll have to release information now, any photographs that they have of a pushback, instead of trying to keep them away from you because you haven't asked for them?
Exactly. Think the 15 judges of the Grand Chamber concluded that Frontex needs to provide us the full, unredacted OLAF report with its annexes, the operational plan, different JORA reports. So those materials were never, to the best of my knowledge, were never even disclosed before the European Parliament, the supervisory body of Frontex. So to tell you whether I'm that naive to think that Frontex will obey the judgment and the findings of the highest judicial instance of the European Union, no, I do not. Then whether this is a game changer for all possible tens of thousands of victims, also no. It was a very important, I think, development in our strategic litigation, but let's not forget that Alaa Hamoudi is one out of 43,000 victims of pushbacks operation taking place in the Aegean between 2020 and 2021. And I'm basing that number on Greek statistics. So Alaa Hamoudi was the one and only person who decided or was in a position to basically take Frontex to court. But that happened thanks to the involvement of a highly resourceful media outlet, Lighthouse Report and Bellingcat, and also to our proactive approach. But it shows you that in the future, I don't think that many applicants would benefit from the involvement of Lighthouse Report or Bellingcat, and you also see the decrease in the coverage of those situations. So I don't see like tens of thousands of victims now piling up more legal actions against Frontex, but it is, of course, a positive development. And another angle to it is that Alaa Hamoudi filed a legal action for damages, which means that he will be hopefully compensated for a violation that already took place. He had to go through that pushback operation before he could file a legal action for damages. And unfortunately, we see this positive development in the jurisprudence of the court only in relation to, for the time being at least, only in relation to legal actions for damages. But before, when I gave you examples about the pharma company challenging the legality of a new taxation, so those legal action for failure to act or legal action for annulment are the ones that actually can prevent the applicant from being subjected to violation. Those legal actions that are subjected, unfortunately, to those restrictive requirements on admissibility. You need to show them that it is certain that when you will cross the Aegean, you will be pushed back in 100% of the cases, which is impossible. So those two legal actions that are better suited to prevent new violation are still, let's say, unattainable for Frontex victims. So it is quite a lot that Frontex victims, now with the new judgment of the Court of Justice, will at least be in a position to have access to the court and to ask compensation. But what about the tens of thousands of potential victims that would like to see a willing judge providing them with a judicial protection before they are being subjected to violations?
Yeah, it's a crazy situation, isn't it? And and I think we could talk about this for a long time. We've been talking for almost an hour, so I wanted to talk about the Greek. You on Front-LEX, you shared a report from Frontex's fundamental human rights officer, who put occasionally the Frontex's fundamental human rights officer puts out a report about human rights abuse cases. They're often highly redacted, but you guys shared one that involved a pushback in Greece using Afghan paramilitaries. I thought this was absolutely crazy. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about this case.
Yeah, I also thought it was crazy, but I think that many million other instances, similar ones, are crazy since the beginning of 2020. So it is not new. The only new thing, maybe I can tell you a bit about the case itself from what you can read in the serious incident report compiled by the Frontex fundamental rights officer. So basically in June 2023, a group of 61, I think, asylum seekers, Turkish asylum seekers, fleeing Turkey because of fear of being exposed to political persecution. So those 61 asylum seekers, including, I think it was 11 minors, they crossed the border between Greece and Turkey, the Evros river, and were almost immediately rounded up by 3 police officers and to 20 third country nationals, what the fundamental right officer named, as you said before, Afghan paramilitaries. They were beaten. Those third country nationals had knives, threatened the asylum seekers that they will be raped, killed. They took their belonging, and after an hour of abusing them, they basically pushed them back to Turkey. And tens of those 61 asylum seekers saw afterwards long was sentenced to long period in prison. And the only thing that is novel, that is new, I think, is the terms that the fundamental right officer decided to assign to those third country national paramilitaries, Afghan soldiers. This is very impressive and shocking. But again, we are aware of similar reports since the beginning of 2020. Alaa Hamoudi himself reported that some of the people that rounded him up were men wearing black We know very little about whether they were Greek or otherwise third country nationals. There are similar reports from 2022, I think it was The Guardian, and again, Lighthouse report, that uncovered clear and cut evidence on the use that the Greek authorities do with asylum seekers, using them as their proxies to push back other asylum seekers. It makes me think about my previous life in Israel. This is very similar to a long-standing practice of the Israeli army in using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Yes, nothing is new about that. The only new thing is that first, the incidents took place already, we said, June, I think, 2023. The serious incident report was concluded last year, December 2025. So this is also this is very intentional and not by mistake, that the fundamental right officer, even when he finally gets the fact right, it takes him 2.5 years to conclude such a serious incident report. Then, it was quite ironic that he cited from the Hamoudi versus Frontex appeal, because again, his conclusion was, yes, it is an established fact that those 60 asylum seekers were pushed back to Turkey, but yet his recommendation to Frontex is to ignore the law, not to comply with Article 46.4, not to terminate operation or to suspend operation in Greece, but very much to the contrary, to increase presence in Greece.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, that? It's like, we're doing something wrong, we have to do more of it to make it better. It's just, crazy. And like you said, I'm not surprised. In a way, I was surprised, but now you think more about it, I'm not that surprised that they are that some countries will use gangsters basically, or paramilitaries to, they're using proxies to do things for them. It's just shocking. What a situation.
Can expect it from defiant member states of the European Union. We cannot accept it when it comes to an EU agency being funded by our taxpayer money, So this is a very big distinction to be made between the member states and the European institutions and agencies.
How are you doing for time, Iftach?
We can do 5 more minutes, maybe, if it's okay with you.
Okay, so I've got my last question that I like to ask at the end. But did you want to talk about your current pending case, or is that going to take too much time, do you think?
Be very, very, I think, interesting for the listeners.
I think so.
So another one of our pending cases that was filed with refugees in Libya and David Yambio on behalf of an Sudanese asylum seeker stranded in Libya. And that case, FM versus Frontex, is seeking the suspension or termination, again, under Article 46.4 of Frontex regulation, is seeking the suspension or termination of the unlawful provision of information on the exact location of refugee boats that Frontex detects in the central Mediterranean and swiftly hands over to Libya, to the so-called Greek Coastguard, Libyan entities and militia. And here I think that, again, you can see how Frontex adapts its modus operandi in different jurisdictions, always with the same objective, the same aim. The one and only objective of Frontex is to avoid new arrivals, new disembarkations in Europe at all costs. So we provided the judges with compelling evidence, clear and cut evidence provided to us by Sea-Watch, showing that when Frontex detects a refugee boat in the central Mediterranean, it immediately classifies it automatically as a distress situation. And I'm not saying that most of those cases are not distress situation, but you need to follow certain guidelines and to try to verify whether the refugee boat, the boat is indeed in a distress situation or not. And the ploy here is that Frontex ignores legislative pieces of constitutional nature, the provision on refoulement, torture. Those ones are being completely ignored because Frontex knows that once it hands over those refugee boats to Libyan militia, upon a forced disembarkation in Libya, those people, 100% of them, by the way, echoing the certainty required by the judges, 100% of those people are subjected to crimes against humanity in connection with arbitrary detention in Libya. Frontex knows it and ignores those the constitutional European law, if you wish. And it relies on one and only provision with the international maritime law, saying that once you detect a distress situation, you need to notify the competent rescue center. So outside of European territorial water, Frontex immediately automatically classifies such a case as a distress situation without trying to verify whether the boat navigates or not, whether it is overcrowded or not. Automatically it classifies it as a distress situation for it to have, let's say, the permission, although it is absolutely baloney, to hand over that refugee boat to the Libyan militia. When Frontex instead is detecting such a refugee boat within the territorial water of a European member state, let's say Italy or Greece or Spain or Malta, it refrains from classifying it as a distress situation in order to provide those member states authorities, let's say Malta or Italy or Greece, with just enough leverage for them to either push back those boats by themselves, or otherwise to summon, to call the Libya militia to enter the territorial waters and to pull back those refugee boats. So if Frontex classifies those cases inside the European territorial water as distress situation, Greece or Italy or Malta will not have just like the audacity or the courage, if you wish, to refrain from launching a search and rescue operation. So this is how the ploy is being revealed, how Frontex adjusts its modus operandi in different jurisdictions with the view to basically avoiding new arrivals at all cost. And also from the evidence that were gathered mainly by Sea-Watch and provided to the judges, you see that Frontex, when it detects such a refugee boat in the pre-frontier area of the central Mediterranean, it refrains from engaging rescue NGOs in the vicinity, sometimes 2 kilometers from the detected refugee boats, waiting for hours until the Libyan militia will get the scene and pull back those poor people back to Libya.
Yeah, like we've had a lot of episodes about the Libyan coastguards and Frontex working with them, and Frontex not communicating with the refugee rescue boats as well. Yeah. So my last question for you now, Iftach. It's been a really great episode. It's been really good to have someone with your knowledge on the legal side of all of this. I like to ask everyone at the end, how do you feel about the future? And I like it when I get an optimistic answer. But if you have no optimism, that's okay. But yeah, so how are you feeling about the future in regards to like people on the move and anything you like, actually?
Oh, I can say I'm optimistic. I think that there are basically two floors to that organizing project of the European Union. What are the European values? I think that the one and only persisting one is that of trying to avoid new arrivals at all costs. So you see that first Frontex is in charge with facilitating the pushbacks, trying to avoid basically new arrivals, and the one that do manage to arrive somehow through some hidden creek in that Frontex maritime wall, they are being rejected here in Europe, and the new legislation show you, and this is the second floor to that project, that the right to seek asylum is being breached and almost inexistent by now. So to tell you that I'm optimistic, unfortunately, I cannot. But I think we all of us that are engaged in trying to protect the rights of people on the move, we protect ourselves at least by our activities. So irrespective of whether we can win that battle or the future ones, at least we need to try and protect ourselves from becoming part of the mainstream.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know if you're familiar with this, an old British politician called Tony Benn, who once said something like, well, the way governments treat refugees is the way they would treat you if they could get away with it. And I think that is such it's something that we need to think about, because like these could, like you said, like by protecting them, we're also protecting ourselves. Because human rights are for everyone, right? And they need to be respected for everyone, no matter who they are. Iftach, that was such a great conversation. Thank you very much for coming on. I will be in touch with Front-LEX. We should get you guys back on again to tell us about some other cases that you're working on. And yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to me as well. Thank you.
Okay, that was episode 88 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Iftach Cohen and everyone at Front-LEX for the amazing work that they do. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've wanted to get Front-LEX on for a while. I'm so glad that they came to speak with us about this amazing case. Okay, at the end of the podcast, I like to tell you to go and check out the blog, which is civilfleet.com. You can find some news stories on there, you'll find some interviews, and you'll also find some investigative reports on there that I've done. So go check out civilfleet.com. Also, if you like what we're doing and you would like to support us, would like to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we have had on this podcast, then you can share us around on social media. You can tell your friends and family about the podcast. You can give us ratings on podcast apps, which would be really handy actually. And you can also make a small donation to us to help us to keep the lights on, as it were, to help us continue to platform these awesome people. Then if you want to help us to do that, then you can go to co-fi.com/civilfleets, donate the price of a coffee or something like that, and that will come to us and help us to continue to do this. Admittedly, the Civil Fleet's costs are super low. I will do this anyway, if you donate or not. But there are a few awesome people that do, so thanks to them. And yeah, anything you give us will be greatly appreciated. So that's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Alright, I'm not sure when I'm going to do another episode. I will hopefully have another one out this month, if I can organise one. May and June is probably going to be tricky because my partner and I are about to have a baby, so I'll be on dad duties, pretty hardcore dad duties for a couple of months, so it might be a while before I get another episode out, but I will try. If I can find time to interview people in May and June, then I'll try to get an episode out to you, but if not, now you know why. Alright, cheers, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.